What if the man everyone saw as a failure, the one they mocked for his stained uniform and tired eyes, was secretly the most powerful protector they would ever know? Elias Vance felt the sting of their laughter every single day. The mop handle felt heavy in his hands, a leaden scepter in a kingdom of polished marble and condescending glares. He was a janitor at Sterling Cross Industries, a ghost who polished away the footprints of men who considered him less than the dirt he cleaned. Garrett Finch, a senior manager with a cruel smirk and designer suits, was the worst. "Hey, Vance," he'd call out, his voice echoing in the grand lobby. "Don't forget that spot by the elevator. A man in your position can't afford to be sloppy. It's all you've got, right?" His cronies would chuckle, their laughter sharp and cutting. Elias would just nod, his expression unreadable, and wipe the spot away. He did it not for Garrett, but for the quiet pride he took in a job well done, a discipline etched into his very soul from another life. His real job, his only job that mattered, started at 5 o'clock. That's when he'd pick up Sophie from her after-school program. Her smile was the only currency he cared about. "Daddy," she'd shout, running into his arms, burying her face in the coarse fabric of his work jacket. She never saw the janitor, she saw her hero, her giant, her entire world. He was a widower, and Sophie was the living, breathing legacy of a love he thought he'd never find again. He'd do anything to protect that legacy. Even this. Even the humiliation. On his way home, he saw Mrs. Gable, his elderly neighbor, struggling with her groceries, a bag tearing at the bottom. Without a word, Elias took the heavy bags from her frail hands, his grip steady and sure. "Oh, Elias, you're a saint," she breathed, her voice thin and grateful. He just gave a small, tired smile. Just a neighbor, ma'am. He didn't see Garrett watching from his luxury sedan across the street, a look of utter contempt on his face. A loser helping a loser. That's all he saw. He didn't see the coiled strength in Elias's posture, or the way his eyes scanned the street, a constant, unconscious threat assessment. He just saw a janitor. And that was Elias's greatest shield. The Saturday sun was a welcome warmth on their faces as Elias pushed Sophie on the swings at the local park. Her laughter was music, a melody that drowned out the echoes of Garrett's taunts. For these few hours, he wasn't the janitor, he was just a daddy. He watched her soar, her small feet kicking towards the sky, and for a moment, the crushing weight of his double life lifted. It was a fragile piece, shattered in an instant. A woman stumbled towards them, her face a mask of terror and pain. Her lip was split, a dark bruise already purpling on her cheek. She clutched the arm of a small boy, while a little girl trailed behind her, crying silently. "Please," the woman gasped, her eyes locking onto Elias's. It was a gaze he recognized, the desperate prayer of the helpless. "Please, you have to help me. My husband, he's coming. He's drunk, and he said he was going to take them." She gestured wildly to her children, her voice breaking. "I tried to leave, and she didn't need to finish." The story was written in the geography of her fear. Elias felt a cold, familiar calm settle over him. He gently stopped Sophie's swing. "Sophie, honey, why don't you go play on the slide for a little bit?" "Stay where I can see you." Sophie, sensing the shift in her father's tone, nodded and ran off, her bright pink jacket a beacon in the chaotic moment. Elias turned back to the woman, his voice low and steady, a rock in her storm. "What's your name?" "Maria," she whispered. "He's not far behind. I saw his car." Elias's eyes did a quick sweep of the park entrance. He noted the exits, the potential threats, the civilians. His mind, a weapon he kept sheathed, was now drawing its edge. "Okay, Maria. You and your children stand behind me. Don't move." She looked at him, at his faded jeans and worn-out t-shirt. Doubt warred with desperation in her eyes. Who was this man? Just another tired-looking father at the park. What could he possibly do? But there was something in his eyes, a stillness that was anything but weak. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane. And right now, she would cling to anything that felt like solid ground. A rusted pickup truck screeched to a halt at the curb, the engine roaring before cutting out abruptly. A large, brutish man stumbled out, his face flushed with rage and alcohol. "Maria," he bellowed, his voice a gravelly roar that made children stop and stare. "You think you can run from me? You think you can take my kids?" He spotted the small group huddled behind Elias and his face twisted into a grotesque sneer. "And who's this? Found yourself a new hero." He lumbered towards them, reeking of cheap whiskey and menace. Maria flinched, pulling her children tighter. Elias didn't move a muscle. He stood as if rooted to the earth, a simple, unassuming obstacle. "Sir, I think you should leave," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying an unnerving authority. The men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think you can tell me what to do, pal? Get out of my way before I move you myself," he shoved Elias, expecting him to stumble, to fall like a bowling pin. But Elias didn't budge. It was like pushing against a granite statue. The man's drunken surprise quickly curdled back into fury. He swung a clumsy, powerful fist aimed at Elias's head. And then, something happened that no one could quite process. It wasn't a fight. It was a dissolution of violence. Elias moved with an economy of motion that was almost invisible. He sidestepped the punch, his hand coming up to gently cup the man's elbow. He applied a whisper of pressure to a nerve cluster, and the man's arm went instantly limp. As the men grunted in confused pain, Elias used his momentum to guide him forward, hooking a foot behind his ankle. The bully went down, not with a crash, but with a controlled, undignified collapse onto the grass. He lay there, gasping, his limbs refusing to obey his drunken commands. Elias hadn't thrown a single punch. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply deconstructed the threat. From a bench across the playground, Clara Hayes, a junior executive from Sterling Cross, watched the entire exchange, her latte forgotten in her hand. She'd come to the park to escape the pressure of a looming deadline, and had recognized the company janitor with his daughter. She had seen the way Garrett Finch treated him. She'd felt a pang of pity. But what she had just witnessed was not pitiful. It was terrifyingly competent. The quiet janitor had just dismantled a man twice his size without breaking a sweat, his face a mask of utter, unnerving calm. The wail of sirens cut through the stunned silence of the park. Someone had called the police. 2 officers arrived, taking in the scene, the weeping mother, the terrified children, the large man groaning on the ground, and the quiet janitor standing over him, his daughter now back by his side, holding his hand. Maria, her voice trembling but clear, told them everything. The officers arrested her husband, who was now spewing incoherent threats. One of the officers turned to Elias. "You handle yourself pretty well. Military." Elias shook his head, pulling Sophie a little closer. "Just a lucky move, officer. I just wanted to keep the kids safe." He was already rebuilding his camouflage, retreating back into the persona of the unremarkable single dad. But the illusion was cracked. Clara approached him hesitantly as the police car pulled away. "Elias. That's your name, right? From the 34th floor." He looked at her, his eyes betraying a flicker of guardedness before settling back into their usual weary calm. "Yes. I'm sorry if that caused a scene. Clara's voice was incredulous. "You were incredible. The way you didn't even fight him, you just stopped him." He offered a small, self-deprecating shrug. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said, her gaze intense. "No, they wouldn't have. I've never seen anything like that." An uncomfortable silence hung between them. He was the men she saw scrubbing floors, the men her boss relentlessly humiliated. But he was also the men who had just displayed a level of control and skill she couldn't comprehend. "Your daughter is lucky to have you," she said softly, looking at Sophie, who was beaming up at her father with pure adoration. "I'm the lucky one," Elias replied, his voice softening as he squeezed his daughter's hand. It was the most he'd ever said to anyone at the office besides a polite hello. Clara felt a strange pull, a desire to understand the puzzle standing before her. Can I buy you and your daughter an ice cream? As a thank you for restoring a little bit of my faith in humanity today." For the first time, Elias offered her a genuine, unguarded smile. It transformed his tired face, revealing a warmth she'd never suspected was there. "We'd like that," he said. Monday morning at Sterling Cross was a return to the harsh reality of fluorescent lights and corporate hierarchy. Elias's brief moment of heroism in the park felt like a dream. Here, he was back to being invisible. But not to everyone. Clara gave him a warm smile as she passed him in the hallway, a small gesture that felt like a shield against the usual barrage of condescension. Garrett Finch, however, was in a particularly foul mood. He cornered Elias by the service elevator, his face pinched with fury. "Vance. I just got a write-up from facilities. Something about a hazardous frayed cable behind my desk. Was that you?" Elias met his gaze evenly. "The insulation was worn through, sir. It was a fire risk. I filed a standard report. You went over my head." Garrett seethed, jabbing a finger into Elias's chest. "You think a janitor gets to report a senior manager? You think you're important?" The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. "I was just doing my job. Your job is to be seen and not heard." Garrett snarled, his voice low and menacing. "I can have you fired. I can make sure you never work in this city again. A single dad like you, it would be a shame if something happened to your precious little income." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "How is your daughter, by the way? Must be tough, raising a kid on a janitor's salary. I hope she doesn't mind wearing second-hand clothes." A dangerous stillness fell over Elias. The air grew cold. For a split second, the janitor vanished, replaced by something ancient and lethal. Garrett felt a primal shiver of fear, though he couldn't understand why. Just as quickly, the mask was back in place. But Clara had seen it. She had been approaching and overheard the entire exchange. "That's enough, Garrett," she said, her voice sharp as glass. Garrett whirled around, surprised. "Stay out of this, Hayes. This is between me and the help." "No," Clara retorted, stepping between them, her posture defiant. "You're harassing an employee. What you just said was unprofessional, cruel, and frankly, pathetic. If you have a problem with the safety report, take it up with the facilities director." "Leave him alone." Garrett stared at her, his ego bruised. For his junior to publicly defy him was unthinkable. He shot Elias a look that promised retribution before storming off. "Thank you," Elias said quietly, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Clara insisted, her eyes full of a new, fierce respect. "I did. Nobody deserves to be treated like that." That evening, the world shrank to the size of their small, cluttered apartment. Elias was helping Sophie with her homework, the mundane task a soothing balm after the confrontation with Garrett. The apartment was sparse but clean, filled with the kind of love that money couldn't buy. Sophie's colorful drawings were taped to the walls, a vibrant gallery of a child's imagination. "Daddy," she asked, looking up from her math worksheet, her expression serious. "Why did Mommy have to go to heaven?" The question, though not new, always hit him with the force of a physical blow. He smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "Because she was very sick, sweetheart. But she gave me the best gift in the entire world before she left me." Sophie whispered. "You," he confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "And that's why we live here. So you can keep me safe." She was parroting a line he'd used long ago, a simplified explanation for a complex, dangerous truth. He had left behind a world of immense wealth and lethal responsibility. The Vance family legacy was not one of boardrooms, but of shadows and secrets. He had walked away from it all to give his daughter a normal life, a life free from the violence that had claimed his wife. "That's right, Starlight," he said. "My only job is to keep you safe." The next day, Clara found him on his lunch break, sitting on a bench in the small corporate plaza. She offered him a coffee. "A peace offering for yesterday's drama," she said with a wry smile. He accepted it gratefully. They talked, really talked, for the first time. She spoke of the immense pressure she was under from Garrett, the constant battle to prove herself in a male-dominated field. He listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made her feel seen. "He's trying to sabotage my presentation for the Henderson account," she admitted, frustrated. "He keeps losing key data files." Elias took a sip of his coffee, his brow furrowed in thought. "Henderson's CEO is a former Marine, Force Recon," he said casually. "He values directness and efficiency, not flashy graphics. And he has a controlling interest in a logistics company that uses encrypted satellite uplinks. Your data isn't lost. Garrett is likely routing it through a dummy server to make you miss your deadline. Check the network's outbound traffic for anomalous pings to a non-Sterling cross IP. You'll find it." Clara stared at him, dumbfounded. How could a janitor possibly know any of that? The military history, the corporate ownership, the specific cyber sleuthing technique. It was an impossibly specific, high-level piece of strategic advice. How did you know that? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He just smiled that enigmatic, tired smile. I read a lot, he said, and left it at that. The mystery of Elias Vance deepened, and so did her fascination. The man Elias had subdued in the park, a brute named Frank Miller, was not accustomed to humiliation. He stewed in a jail cell for a night, his rage fermenting. Upon his release, fueled by a bruised ego and a thirst for vengeance, he started making calls. Frank was small-time muscle, but he worked for bigger, more dangerous people who moved in the same circles of casual corruption as Garrett Finch. They had attended the same golf fundraisers, the same backroom poker games where favors were currency. Frank learned who Elias was, a janitor at Sterling Cross. He also learned about the public dressing down Garrett had received from his subordinate, Clara, for defending that same janitor. An ugly alliance was forged over a bottle of expensive scotch. This janitor, Garrett slurred, his face flushed with resentment, he thinks he's something special. And Hayes, she needs to be taught a lesson about loyalty. Frank's eyes gleamed with malice. I don't care about the woman. I want the man. He made me look like a fool. I want to take away what he loves. Garrett, his judgment clouded by spite, didn't hesitate. He pulled up Elias's employee file on his phone. It had his address. It had his emergency contact information, which listed Sophie's after-school program. He picks his kid up at 5, Garrett said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. Every day. Like clockwork, the plan was simple and savage. They would snatch the girl. Not to harm her, Frank assured a momentarily hesitant Garrett, but to use her as leverage. To break the father. To force him to his knees and make him beg. For Garrett, it was the ultimate power play, a way to crush the janitor and put the defiant Clara Hayes back in her place. For Frank, it was pure, unadulterated revenge. The threat was no longer about a job or public mockery. It had spiraled into something far more sinister. It was now aimed at the one thing in the world Elias had sacrificed everything to protect. And they had no idea who they were truly dealing with. They were poking a sleeping dragon, believing it to be a lizard. The city's shadows were about to learn the name Elias Vance all over again. The air that afternoon felt different. A strange tension hummed beneath the surface of the city, a frequency only Elias could feel. It was an old instinct, a ghost sense that had kept him alive in places where death was a constant companion. He left work a few minutes early, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. He saw the black sedan parked across from Sophie's school. It was unremarkable, but it didn't belong. The windows were too dark. The men inside sat too still. His blood ran cold. They were professionals. He circled the block, his mind a furious cascade of tactical analysis. He pulled out a burner phone, a relic from his past he always kept charged, and dialed a number from memory. A single, coded phrase was all he said before disconnecting. The nightingale's cage is compromised. Then he moved. He didn't run. He walked with a calm, predatory grace towards the school's entrance, arriving just as the final bell rang. Sophie burst out, her backpack bouncing, her face alight with a smile when she saw him. Daddy. At that exact moment, 2 men got out of the sedan. Frank Miller was one of them. The other was a hard-faced stranger. They started towards Sophie. The world seemed to slow down. The laughter of children faded into a dull roar. Elias saw only the threat vectors, the closing distance, the hand reaching for his daughter. Sophie, he said, his voice dangerously calm. Run to Mrs. Davison. Now, she saw the look in his eyes and didn't question it. She ran. Frank lunged. Not so fast, he snarled. But he was grabbing at air. Elias was no longer there. In a blur of motion, he intercepted Frank, his hand striking the man's throat, not a killing blow, but a precise nerve strike that collapsed his airway just enough to send him choking to the ground. The second man pulled a weapon, but he never had a chance to aim it. Elias disarmed him with brutal efficiency, a complex wrist lock that shattered the man's bone with an audible crack. The gun clattered to the pavement. Elias kicked it away, his movements fluid and devastating. This wasn't the men from the park. This was a ghost, a weapon in human form. Just as the second man crumpled in agony, a gleaming black SUV, the kind used by government agencies, screeched to a halt beside them. Two men in sharp, tactical suits emerged, weapons drawn but held low. The leader, a man with a scarred face and respectful eyes, looked at Elias. "It's been a long time, sir," he said, his voice betraying a deep, buried history. The mask was gone. The janitor was gone. Before the shocked eyes of parents and teachers, Elias Vance, the mocked single father, stood revealed as something else entirely. A man of immense power, a man who commanded loyalty from dangerous people, a man who had just unleashed a lifetime of restrained violence to protect his child. The aftermath was swift and absolute. The arrival of Elias's former team, a unit that answered only to the highest, most secretive echelons of the Vance family's security apparatus, changed everything. They moved with quiet, terrifying efficiency, securing the scene, taking the subdued assailants into custody, and creating a perimeter that local law enforcement couldn't penetrate. Frank Miller and his accomplice were handed over to the police, but not before Elias's associate, the scarred man named Cale, had a quiet word with the lead detective, flashing credentials that made the officer go pale. The official story would be a foiled kidnapping by common criminals. The real story was far more complicated. Garrett Finch was implicated within the hour. Cale's team, using data from the burner phone's brief signal, had already been investigating the source of the threat. They traced Frank's recent calls directly to Garrett. When two impeccably dressed, stone-faced individuals from an internal corporate security firm nobody had ever heard of showed up at Sterling Cross, Garrett's smug world imploded. They didn't just fire him, they escorted him from the building in handcuffs, his assets frozen, his life systematically dismantled for conspiring in a felony kidnapping. The news spread through the office like wildfire. The janitor, the man they had all ignored or pitted, was at the center of it all. Clara stood outside the school, watching the scene unfold, her mind struggling to reconcile the two images of Elias. The humble, kind man who had fixed her printer and the lethal protector who moved like a phantom. Sophie ran into Elias's arms, safe and sound, oblivious to the deeper implications of what had happened. All she knew was that her daddy had, once again, been her hero. As the chaos subsided, Elias walked over to Clara, his expression weary. "I have a lot to explain," he said, his voice heavy. "You don't work for a secret government agency, do you?" she asked, a touch of wry humor in her voice, a defense against the shock. He shook his head. "It's older than that. And more private. My family. I walked away from it a long time ago to protect her," he nodded towards Sophie. "But it seems it finally caught up with me." Clara looked from his steely eyes to the fierce, loving way he held his daughter's hand. The puzzle pieces clicked into place. The quiet dignity, the hidden depths, the shocking competence. It all made a terrible, beautiful kind of sense. She reached out and took his other hand. "You're still the same man who helped Mrs. Gable with her groceries," she said, her voice unwavering. "That's the man I see." In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his hidden past, he didn't feel alone. In the weeks that followed, Elias Vance navigated the collision of his two worlds. The Vance family, the powerful and shadowy dynasty he had abandoned, wanted him back in the fold. They saw his re-emergence as an opportunity. But Elias met with the patriarch, his estranged father, not as a prodigal son, but as a man who had found something more valuable than power or wealth. He made a new deal, on his terms. He would act as an occasional consultant, a silent guardian for the family's legitimate interests, but he would never again be their weapon. His life was here, with Sophie. His first act using his renewed influence was for Maria. He set her and her children up in a new city, with a new home, a trust fund for their education, and the best security money could buy, ensuring Frank Miller or anyone like him could never touch them again. He was the selfless helper, now with limitless resources. His life at Sterling Cross was over. He resigned, leaving behind the mop and the mockery forever. But he didn't leave Clara. Their connection, forged in the crucible of crisis, deepened into a profound love. She wasn't intimidated by his past, she was in awe of the men who had walked away from it all for the love of his child. She saw the protector, but she had fallen for the father. Their families blended seamlessly. Clara, who had always prioritized her career out of a fear of being hurt, found a home in the simple, fierce love between Elias and Sophie. Elias, who had thought his heart was buried with his wife, found a new and vibrant love with Clara, a partner who saw and cherished every part of him, the janitor and the warrior. One sunny afternoon, months later, they were back at that same park. Elias was pushing Sophie on the swings, her laughter echoing just as it had before. Clara sat on the bench, watching them, her heart full. He was no longer hiding. He wore a simple pair of jeans and a comfortable sweater, but he stood taller, the weight of his secret finally lifted. He was just a man, a father, in love. What happens when the world finally sees the hero that was hiding in plain sight? He doesn't seek revenge or glory. He simply continues to build a life worthy of the love he fought so hard to protect. And it begs the question, how many heroes do we walk past every day, their true strength hidden beneath a humble uniform? What incredible stories are waiting to be seen if we only choose to look closer?